Thank you for choosing to watch this video. I'll be tying a muddled pulling daddy. This is a pattern I came up with earlier in the year and had some success with it recently. Unfortunately, I lost the test pattern in a tree, so I've had to restock my boxes. Start by mounting your hook in the vise. Here I'm using one of Fulling Mill's tactical Shorty hooks in size 14. Once you've got the hook mounted and tested, catch on your tying thread. For this fly I'm using Semperfli's classic wax thread in 12 knot. As this is a muddler head, I've left a little bit of clearance at the eye. Trim off your waste thread once you've got it caught on. For the detached body I've used some of Semperfli's Suede Chenille medium size in a brown colour. You want to lay a smooth underbody before you catch on the detached body. I only want to tie it in for a short length because I don't want to build up too much bulk in the body, but I do want a little bulk at the tie-in point, as this will help splay the legs when I tie them in. You can see that I've singed a point at the end of the detached body. So I'll tidy up the tie-in point of the chenille and take the thread back to the end of the body. The body in this fly is formed with Fulling Mill's Seal X dub in a Midas colour. The first part of that ply I want to keep to quite a small tight ball. This will help splay the legs when I tie them in at the next step. This is a nice dubbing, it's quite easy to apply to the thread, especially if you moisten your fingers a little bit first. Take your time and keep the dubbing ball quite neat and tight. And I'll put on a locking wrap, folding any fibres back to stop too many of them going forward. And then I'll select some knotted pheasant tail legs. These are from Veniard's, and as usual for most of my daddy patterns I'll tie in 3 on either side, and I'll position them on the sides or slightly below the hook shank. Pinch and loop to catch them on. Just check that you're happy with the position, and then tie on the 3 at the other side. Want the legs to be about the same length as the detached body, if not slightly longer. So just measure them up, make sure they're the same length at either side, and catch on with a couple of wraps and then check that you're happy with where they're sitting. And then if you're happy you can trim away the waste ends and then tidy up the tie-in point with a few wraps of thread. Take the thread back down to the tying point where the legs are, and now dub the rest of the body. This is quite a short body because we've got 3 hackles to tie in and also a muddler head, which takes up a little bit of space. You don't need too heavy a body on this fly, as it's largely going to be covered up with the hackles and the muddler head. You don't want to take the body too close to the eye of the hook, because you do need to leave space for the, as I say, for the hackles and the muddler head. Once you've got the body formed, next step is to tie in the hackles. So we're using 3 Mallard flank feathers. The first one dyed yellow. As you can see, I've stripped the barbules from one side. This is to keep the hackles sparse and avoid building up too much bulk. Because the feather's fragile, rather than pulling away the tip like I would normally would, I'll snip it away. As we're tying in multiple hackles, we'll cover up the waste ends anyway. Once you've tied it in and trimmed the waste away, tidy up the tie-in point, and we'll wrap only a couple of turns of feather. This is to keep the hackle sparse and make sure it has plenty of movement in the finished fly. And to try and make sure I distribute the feather evenly around the hook. I've got my 2 turns, one in front of the other, then I'll catch it in with a tying thread with a couple of turns of thread, and then I'll trim off the end I don't want. Again, keeping the turns of thread to a minimum to avoid building too much bulk. Tidy up the tying point. You'll notice that as I do this I'm eating into the clear space I left at the head of the fly. This shouldn't matter too much. So I catch in the next hackle, which I prepared in the same way, but this one's dyed orange. You do need to be careful working with these feathers as they are very fragile and it can be quite easy to break them. Again, just the 2 turns of the hackle. It does look quite sparse at first, but because there are 3 hackles it will soon builds up. Take your time when catching in the feather to make sure it's sitting where you want and you're not trapping too many of the barbules down. Again, just a couple of turns of thread should be enough to hold it. Trim away the waste and then tidy up the tie-in point again. Trying to use the thread turns as efficiently as possible. And then the last hackle is a natural mallard flank. Again, prepared in exactly the same way and tied in the same way. You'll notice that these feathers are really quite long, probably look too long, but this gives a great amount of movement to the fly, and to be fished as a pulling fly it gets a lot of attraction for the fish and works quite well. Again, tie in the feather and tidy up the tying point, then just 2 turns of feather. You could of course play with the colours of feather you use to create different effects. It's always worth experimenting with these things. Catch the feather in the same way as we have with the previous 2 hackles, trim away the waste, then tidy up the tying point, and we want to position the thread ready to tie in the muddler head. So put the thread just in front of the hackles. Take a little bit of time to make sure you've got all your hackle fibres sitting where you want, and it's easier to distribute them now with the brush than it is after the head's been tied in. It's probably worth experimenting with how heavily you tie the muddler head on these flies. For this one I'm going to keep it quite light so that I don't limit the movement of the fly. It'll still have enough presence in the water to attract the fish. For the head in this fly I'm using a natural roe deer. So you select your bunch and again strip out the underfur, which is important for this fly as we want the deer hair to spin nicely. Once you've stripped out the underfur, stack it to align the tips. I wasn't quite happy with the first bunch of deer hair I prepared, so I took the time to get a second one set up. It's always worth getting the materials right before you tie them in. And it's never going to work quite right if you try and force something to work. So once you get your stack of deer hair measure for length, you want to be slightly careful. You don't want to crowd the gape of the fly or the hackles too much. I also trim the deer hair to length a bit. I don't want it so long that it's awkward to spin, but I want it long enough that I can easily hold the hair back out of the way while I tie off the fly. So to spin the muddler head, 2 loose straps around the deer hair, and then pull the thread round and let it spin as you go. It's quite hard to describe the movement, but after a few goes you'll soon get the hang of it and the feel for the spin. So a little touch with a brush to make sure I've not trapped any hairs, and then I'll fold the hair back from the eye, trying to keep it all neat and smooth without folding any over the eye of the hook. Then I'll bring the thread to the eye and throw in a few wraps to hold it up in place, and then I'll whip finish. I'll put my whip finisher on the thread, and then with my hand holding a bobbin I'll use my fingers to fold the hair out of the way to give me clear space to throw in a 3-turn whip finish. And as I pulled it tight, the thread broke, fortunately quite cleanly. I will put the varnish on the head of the fly, or the UV resin as I'm using here, before I trim the deer hair. This means I can pull the deer hair back to give me clear space. Sorry, getting my fingers in the way. And I'll set the resin, and then I just need to trim the muddler head. I like to take my time when I'm trimming muddler heads, using small snips so I can control the shape I'm creating. It by no means has to be perfect, but I do like to try and keep the general shape of the head as symmetrical as possible. This will help prevent the fly from spinning as you pull it through the water. I recently started using these new scissors for trimming muddler heads. They're slightly less curved than the scissors I used to use, and this creates a slightly wider head. Push a bit more water. You want to be careful not to trim too many of the hair tips and spoil the collar. Sometimes it's helpful to pull the waist ends forward to try and separate them a little bit from the tips you want to keep and isolate them so they're easier to cut. As you can see, I work my way continuously around the fly to try and keep a consistent shape. Half the trick with muddler heads is knowing when to stop trimming. It can be quite difficult not to keep tweaking and changing the shape. That's looking pretty good. I just want to make sure I have the eye clear. As you can see, it's quite a light head, but it'll still move some water, but allow plenty of movement in the rest of the fly. A little touch with a brush to sort out the final shape. And that's the fly finished. Thank you for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, please drop it a like, subscribe to my channel, and as always, any comments and feedback are always appreciated.